already have that.
Okay.
And tape is rolling.
All set?
All set.
All right. I wanted to start off with your experience here at Southern Illinois University. I know McAnda's been your home for a long time, but were there other factors that played a role in making your final decision to come here after you left the Senate?
Well, unquestionably, the fact that my daughter is here and her husband and I have 2 grandchildren here, that played a role. Plus, this is an area where there are real needs. Southern Illinois University has a high percentage of first-generation college students. We have a higher than average percentage of minority students. Coming here compared to going to one of the Ivy League schools, or, I got offers from Massachusetts to Texas to California. But in most of these schools, I'd be paid, frankly, a lot more than I would be paid here. But I wouldn't be helping students who need help as much as here.
Okay. How do you define your role here at SIU? What are your goals as the director of the Public Policy Institute?
Well, it's kind of 2 different roles. One is as a teacher, where I hope to stimulate an interest and an attitude. Now, when I provide tests, as I'm going to in a few days from the time we're taping this, I have to test on knowledge. But what I'm really interested in is that they see themselves as catalysts for change, that they really try to help build a better world. The very first class I have, I ask, like the legislative process class, I ask them 2 questions. One, what kind of a world would you like to see? And second, what are you willing to do to achieve it? And that second question is what I hope I can get them interested in doing. Then the Public Policy Institute is a different kind of role. Here we want to take on cutting edge issues. And we are, for example, the only public policy institute in the world, so far as I know, that has looked at Rwanda and the 800,000 or million people slaughtered there. And what kind of lessons can we learn? We're the only public policy institute that has looked at the whole question of a longer school year. We go to elementary and high school here. Most any state does is 180 days. Singapore, you go 280. Germany, 240. Japan, 243. Why do we go 180? Well, in theory, so our children can go out and harvest the crops. Well, that was a different era. But we were on cutting edge things, some of which are controversial. We had one on alternatives to incarceration. We have more people in our prisons and jails per 100,000 than any other country in the world. Is this really necessary? Does this make sense for the people who are incarcerated and for the taxpayers? Anyway, those are the kinds of things we're doing.
So the Public Policy Institute is 4 years old now?
It is about 4.5 years old now, yes.
Are you pleased with the progress that you've made so far? Do you think you have a long way to go? Or?
Well, I am pleased at the progress we have made. We've been able to get some concrete things done. One of the things, for example, we worked on campaign finance reform and got a major bill passed when most people said we couldn't get anything passed. And the governor flew down and signed the bill in the next room over here, right in our offices.
Great. I guess we can start off. You began your professional life as a journalist in Troy, where you made quite a name for yourself exposing corrupted practices in your county near St. Louis. What was it that made you decide to explore public service through politics after your experience as a journalist?
Well, it was really kind of an accident. And I was always interested in public policy. But when I was a teenager, the person who everyone read was a political columnist named Walter Lippmann. And I wanted to be a Walter Lippmann. People would read the wisdom that I could provide. And then I took over this small newspaper, and I would write about national and international events. And once in a while, somebody picked up a something I said and was reprinted somewhere, but not very much. And then I ran into this very corrupt situation where there were just blatant payoffs for our sheriff and prosecuting attorney. And I started writing about it, and one thing led to another. And then we had the nationally televised hearings run by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. And I was asked to come and testify. And I testified, and then some people were, and I have to say not too many, but some people were saying, you ought to run for public office. At that point, I was trying to get someone who was honest to run for sheriff and state's attorney, but people were afraid. And so I was young and brash and decided I would run for state representative. And I did, and to my own surprise and the surprise of almost everyone else in the area, I won.
But was there any sort of defining moment where you said that that's where you wanted your life to go at that point?
Well, that kind of steered me in that direction. I enjoyed policy making, and I always have enjoyed it. But I have to say I enjoyed the newspaper work, and I enjoy most things. Now, there are some drawbacks in every profession. In policy making, I didn't enjoy raising campaign funds. That's just something I always found distasteful. But there are drawbacks in every field.
How has politics in Illinois changed since you first took office as a state representative, and do you attribute any of this change to your own efforts as a legislator?
Well, I think one of the things I was able to contribute was to reducing the blatant corruption that was part of the scene. Not too long after I was elected, I wrote an article for Harper's Magazine titled "The Illinois Legislature, a Study in Corruption." And that blatant corruption, I'm not saying there isn't some of it, but it is not like it once was. Now, what we do have, and what I regret and what has changed, is we have a more sophisticated form of corruption through how we finance campaigns. And that means that lawmakers and governors and presidents are too often inclined to try and do favors for people who are going to make big campaign contributions. And that's not a healthy thing for our democracy.
What was the air like when you first got in with other politicians that you were a young man at the time? Was there any kind of air of resentment or anything, you going in and writing all this about the corrupted practices?
Well, I didn't write about that until after I'd been there for a few years, and of course there was great resentment to that. There was a dinner that was held regularly, I don't know if it's still held or not, where the lobbyists would all pay money to come to the dinner, and the money would be divided among the legislative leaders. And I regularly didn't attend those dinners because I just felt it was not a very healthy practice. But at one of those, after I wrote that article, someone got up, one of the state senators, and announced that they were going to have a Benedict Arnold Award each year, and I was the first winner of the Benedict Arnold Award. But not too long, a few months after I wrote that article, one of the Chicago papers obtained, illegally as it turned out, but obtained a tape of two lobbyists telling how they were spending $30,000 to kill a bill, just bribing legislators. And it just spelled out what I had said, and that took some of the pressure off.
How did you handle resentment from your peers at that time, being so young and inexperienced in the way politics run?
Well, you always have to, I don't care whether you're young or old or in between, you always prefer people to approve what you do rather than disapprove. But part of leadership is being willing to develop a little bit of a tough skin. And if you're just going to try and do the popular thing, then you're not a leader. Leadership means doing what is popular sometimes, but sometimes doing what is unpopular.
When do you think you sort of came into your own about your ideology towards public service, you know, as far as you know, not, you know, you showed your assets. You were one to always to show how much you made. When did you sort of have it in your mind that this is the route I want to go, this is the path I want to take as a public servant?
Well, I think, yeah, I really have to go back to my youth and my parents, and particularly my father. My father was a Lutheran minister who believed you have to help poor people, you have to help the less fortunate, and you have to, just kind of fundamental, if our system is to work, you have to be honest. And my parents were active in what we then called race relations, we'd call civil rights today. I think I acquired those interests from them. I remember when I was 8 years old, I went with my father to hear Eleanor Roosevelt speak. Years later, I had the chance to get acquainted with her, and I told her about hearing her speak when I was 8 years old. But my parents clearly instilled in me a sense of what life is all about, and that you're here not just to live and pile up money or fame or whatever for yourself. You're here to serve others.
In an interview that we taped with your mom late last year, she described your methodology as a legislator by saying that you just do what makes sense. Describe your approach to working towards successful legislation. Is it as easy as just making sense of an issue?
Well, sometimes it's hard to know what makes sense, but I have never approached an issue saying this is the Democratic way of doing things or that's the Republican way of doing things. I'm a great believer that most issues, I would say more than 90% of the issues, have no political philosophy at all. You know, like I'm working on the problems of water right now, working with the State Department and others. Well, there's not a Democratic way of solving the world water problem or a Republican way, or fixing the highway right in back of you out there. There's not a Republican way of doing that or a Democratic way. And so we have to find ways of people working together.
Despite being admittedly liberal on many issues, you achieved notoriety as one who was able to work successfully with Republicans, gaining respect and admiration from representatives on both sides of the political aisle. What's the key, in your opinion, to breaking down partisan barriers that frequently halt legislation and create divisions within government agencies?
I would say there are two answers to that. First, when people ask me, are you liberal or conservative, I say, give me the issue, and I'll tell you where I stand on that issue, and you make your judgment. And so most people, for example, in the area of race relations, they would find my record a liberal record. When it comes to fiscal policy and having pay-as-you-go government, they would find that my record is a conservative record. I think the second thing, and that really is a key to working together, is whenever I stood up in debate, I always said to myself before I got in debate with someone, this person is just as sincere as I am. And it kind of takes the edge off of it. And so I remember one time a New York Times reporter said he had just talked to Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms, two senators I had disagreed with a great deal on the floor. And both of them had praised me, and he wanted to know how come. And I gave him that answer. And I remember about 2 years ago, my first wife died. And I got calls from Bill Clinton and Hillary and some of the people you would expect to get phone calls from. But I also got a call from Jesse Helms. And in a strange way, I kind of appreciated that call as much as any call I received.
So how did you strike a balance then between, you know, issues that you felt passionately about and disagreed with very strongly with people, and keeping, you know, a relationship, a professional relationship?
Well, you can still disagree strongly with someone. For example, Jesse Helms, I just mentioned. Jesse and I, I can't remember any time the two of us stood up on the same side on an issue. I'm sure there must have been some, but I can't recall it just offhand. But we always maintained a cordial relationship because he knew I was sincere, I knew that he was. And so that, it takes the edge off of things. There's just no question that it does. And unlike, for example, faculty disputes here at Southern Illinois University, where sometimes on little minor things, people will get very bitter personally about things. In the United States Senate, you've reached the professional level where people will understand there are going to be disagreements, and they're not going to get personally bitter about it.
Okay. You ran for U.S. presidency in the 1988 elections. Many people who I've spoke with throughout the course of this project have said they're, in their opinion, how much better this country would be if you had been elected. Well, number one, how do you respond to that personally as a comment to you? And also, what are some main areas of legislation that you were looking forward to tackling? And are there any major issues that you would have handled differently that the people who were elected for that office have held since your campaign?
Well, I suppose in the part of the latter part of your question, different people handle things differently. One of the things that I determined early on was that if I got elected, I was going to do the very best job I could for 4 years, and I wasn't going to take any polls. I was just going to get out there and lead for the best interests of the people of the nation. And I would have been controversial. I think that's part of leadership. But on health care, education, and some other issues, and also being more responsive to the rest of the world. I think part of the tragedy of September 11th, and nothing justifies what those terrorists did, but I think we have to recognize that much of the world resents our insensitivity, and that insensitivity comes across to them as arrogance. And I like to believe that I could have shifted our response to the rest of the world a little and maybe diminished the possibilities of this kind of unjustified and unprovoked attack.
Is it a flattering statement when you hear somebody say how much better they think that the country would be?
Well, it is generous of them to say, and I hope they would have felt that way if I had been elected president.
How did you approach campaigning with liberal voters when you had a fiscally conservative record? How did you explain that to them?
Well, I would tell them, for example, even today, we're spending about $350 billion a year on interest. Fiscal year 1962, the total budget of the federal government reached $100 billion for the first time. Now we're spending 3.5 times that money on interest. What do we get for interest? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, if we can balance the budget, which I'm not sure what's happening right now because of, as we tape, we face this international emergency, and there was a big tax cut voted that I would have voted against based on the projections. Those projections can be wildly off. It's like projecting who's going to win between the Cardinals and the Cubs. You can maybe make a semi-accurate guess, but that's about as much as you can do. And you shouldn't pass sweeping tax cuts on the basis of those kind of projections. Now, I'm got away from your question. I forget what the heck it was now.
I think you did a pretty good job.
Oh, okay.
Are we good on tape?
Right, we're doing 19 minutes so far.
Okay. In your opinion, what is the role of a public servant? What responsibility does an elected official have to his or her constituents?
I think there are two principal responsibilities. Maybe I should make that three. One is to make sure government is honest. That's just kind of basic. I think everyone understands that. Second, government should respond to the needs of those who are less fortunate in society. If you lift those who are less fortunate, then everyone else is going to do all right too. And that reflects a difference in philosophy. Some people believe what we have to do is to give tax breaks to the to the president of General Motors. My belief, and then he will stimulate the nation by what he does. My belief is, while I want to see him paying not an unfair share of the taxes, my belief is if you see to it that people at the bottom earn enough money so they buy the Chevrolets and the other cars, then the president of General Motors is going to do all right too. We have to help people at the bottom, and if you don't help people at the bottom, then there is a gap that grows between those who are more fortunate and those who are less fortunate. And if that gap gets too big, then there's an explosion, and we have to avoid that. And then the third thing you have to do as a public servant is to communicate to people. If you're really leading, you're going to do some unpopular things. And you have to go out and explain to people why you're doing those things. Just as an example, I've always opposed capital punishment. Not a popular position. It's a little less unpopular today than it once was. But I remember the first polls we did when I was a senator showed 85% of the people in Illinois favoring capital punishment. Well, I had to explain to people why I was on that side of things. Or another issue was the gays in the military issue, where the huge percentage of the population thought gays shouldn't be in the military. Well, I pointed out that up until 1982 or 83, we didn't discriminate that way. We discriminated. I was involved in Army intelligence. We did not permit classified information to go to people who were homosexual because of the possibility of being blackmailed to provide classified information. But then you talk to people and you explain and you say, well, you know, the Bible, they usually bring up the Bible. There's a commandment in the Bible on adultery. And I said, from my Army days, if we kicked out everyone who was involved in adultery, our ranks would have been thinned appreciably. Well, you usually get a chuckle from the audience there. And then I say, let's just imagine we have a national emergency and we're going to have a draft. And we say, if you're gay, you're not going to be drafted. We'd end up with an awful lot of gays in this country all of a sudden. You know, when you explain things to people, they frequently will come around and understand your point of view a little more.
You would hope.
We hope.
In your book, The Glass House, you say, and I quote, "Human beings have flaws. Those who rule for us should provide example as well as seek justice. But if the public expects too much by way of example, inevitably there will be great disappointments." Your public record is one of honesty, full disclosure, and uncompromising desire to do what's right, regardless of how it would affect your approval rating. My question is, where's the dent in the armor? What are some decisions that you've made that you are the least proud of?
Oh, I'm sure I sometimes could, because we all want to get reelected, and I'm sure sometimes I didn't stand up as courageously as I might have. Maybe I took the stand that I thought was right, but I didn't make speeches on behalf of it. wasn't as strong as I should have been. And but I think fundamentally I've tried to follow my conscience on things. I've cast some bad votes in retrospect, but I thought at the time they were right votes. I voted for airline deregulation. At the time they said this will cause many more airlines to come into existence, and we'll have much better service for smaller communities. Well, precisely the opposite has happened. But the answer is I have flaws. We all have flaws. I was always a candidate for Congress or senator or president. I was never a candidate for sainthood. And the people who know me well will recognize that I wouldn't have made it as a candidate for sainthood.
Of all the legislation you sponsored, voted for, or worked to help get passed, is there one piece that stands out in your mind and makes you say, that was important, that helped a lot of people?
Well, it's hard to know which ones you pinpoint, and historians can maybe give a better answer. I was involved in passing legislation that said all young people with disabilities have to be helped by our public schools. That has helped millions of young people. Prior to that passage, we had a lot of public schools that if you're blind, if you're deaf, if you're in a wheelchair, sorry, we're not going to help you. A majority of the mentally retarded were being given no help by the public schools. And so that has given me a lot of satisfaction. If I can use a little illustration, not use up too much time on that tape, when I was a presidential candidate, I spoke at Hamilton High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And they knew I was involved in the passage of that legislation. They arranged for a chorus of mentally retarded young people to sing for me. First, they recited in unison the preamble to the Constitution. Retarded kids, you know, just very impressive. And then they sang, "This is my country." And I had about a dozen reporters with me. And we were all choked up. And I remember looking back, and the reporter for ABC, she had tears running down her cheeks. And I looked at those young people and I thought to myself, is politics rough? Yes, sometimes it is. Is it worth it? You bet. If we hadn't passed that legislation, maybe half of those young people would have been in institutions. So that's one. And then other things that are not as dramatic, but the direct student loan program, which has saved, which has meant that a lot more students can get loans and get them for less money. That's been helpful to a lot of people. And then other things that you don't know what the impact is going to be. The last piece of legislation I passed called for research on finding less expensive ways of converting salt water to fresh water. Maybe in the world that we're going to be facing, that's more important than anything else I did. I don't know.
Your schedule here.
No, we're at 28 minutes.
Okay, let's change this.
We're going to switch tapes here just a
Okay.
minute.